Such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Darren. I think of you as one of the most important thinkers of our time, touching on really, really critically important issues related to our global economic lives, how it's changing, how our lives are also being changed dramatically thanks to the actions of big tech and emerging AI and the economic security or lack thereof we're seeing spill over in many parts of the world. So super honored to have you in conversation.
Thank you for saying such nice things. After so many nice sentences, there must be a but coming.
You know what? It was an and I knew that you were amazing when I met you like in person on campus, and then I was just so like happy and joyful to hear of you receiving the Nobel Prize this past year, Darren. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Nishat, my wonderful colleague from JNU in Delhi, like Nishat, why don't you ask Darren a first question?
Yeah, just so to give like a brief background of Darren's work, which actually needs no introduction and which won him the Nobel last year along with Simon Johnson and James Robinson, is that his most important work that features through this is his work on political institutions and how inclusive institutions versus extractive institutions kind of shape our shared prosperity in different directions. And it's my immense honor to co-welcome you today, Professor Darren. And I recently read your latest book on Power and Progress, 1000 Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, co-written with Simon Johnson, and thought it made some really interesting points around the history of technological innovation. So just to kind of go back to your debate on inclusive and extractive institutions, I just wanted to kind of understand, is your argument around institutional persistence extremely relevant in a world which is shaped by these vast technological advancements, or are we in some way witnessing a digital extractive form of institution which is taking over our shared prosperity and kind of minimizing it?
I think that's an excellent question to get us started, Nishat, because it's one where, in some sense, my thinking has changed over time, where to sort of place the interplay between institutions and technological systems. And by technological systems, I don't mean just like a specific technique, but ecosystems of different technological approaches. And I think when we did our initial work in 2000s, and when James Robinson and I wrote Why Nations Fail, we put the emphasis on the institutional structure, and technology was just an outcome, and innovation was and is still in my mind a main driver of economic dynamism, prosperity. But the recent experience of the United States and many other Western nations underscores that different types of technological ecosystems actually could interact in much more nuanced ways with institutions, because they can create their own monopolies in a way that changes the character of institutions. And that was the sort of wake-up call for me in sort of thinking about, I used to think of Silicon Valley as just a source of entrepreneurship, risk-taking, innovation, but it's actually more than that. It's also a way of structuring institutions.
Absolutely. I think a lot about some of the mantras or kind of so-called gospels of Silicon Valley. I'm literally sitting here in Silicon Valley as we do this conversation before driving down to Los Angeles after our conversation today. I grew up here. I remember hearing a lot about how tech was offered to be different, think different. I went to the same high school as Steve Jobs and Wozniak. More recently, there's this sort of phrase circulating around Silicon Valley: move fast and break things. And I sort of thought about the different kind of incarnations of Silicon Valley. So-called technology companies have completely reordered life in areas that are not explicitly technology, right? The biggest hotel and accommodation provider in the history of the world is a so-called tech company. The biggest taxi company in the history of the world is a technology company. The
Hmm.
biggest media company in the history of the world, Meta, is a technology company. Now we've seen tech spill over into the American administration and directly have a coziness with President Trump. I'm wondering what you feel like the directions that big tech has taken, one, and two, its connections now with the new administration mean for so-called enduring, inclusive, we might even say democratic institutions.
Well, actually, I think, Ramesh, those are very important issues, but there are two separate, or at least I would like to answer them in two separate pieces.
Please.
I think the first one is about the arc of tech, and that's very reflective of my own thinking on this. I think you were hinting at that as well. In the early stages when the computer pioneers of the 1970s were making innovations in their garages, tech was sort of a startup industry that was challenging incumbents. So you can think of it as adding competitiveness to the economy. I think that's also continued for a while, even with, established companies such as, Fairfield Semiconductors, Intel, and so on. But with Microsoft first and then Google, Facebook, Amazon, they've become so big that now they are the forces of monopoly. So in some sense, I think the culture of Silicon Valley, if I'm understanding it right, and I've followed it for 3 decades, although I'm not inside of it, is that I think most people in Silicon Valley 3 decades ago would have wholeheartedly agreed with Lord Acton when he said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Today, they would say absolute power corrupts absolutely, except when it's in big tech's hand. So Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, those powers are always benign. But that's the problem. I think an institutional and historical set of lenses makes you realize that can't be true. Even with the best intentions, if you make a company so big and so powerful, it's going to start crush its rivals. It's going to have excessive influence on the direction of technology, which has been my focus. It's going to have an influence on the direction of policy. And we're seeing all of these. So that's the first part. The second part, the relationship between big tech and Trump. Well, there, I think the situation in my mind is a little more nuanced, but not in a good way, in a bad way. So I believe that the major technology companies were already very, very influential before Trump. So I don't think that Trump's kleptocratic regime is necessarily going to increase their power. But there is another risk, which is even worse. You might think, what could be worse than an oligarchy of five companies, being so influential? Well, there is something worse. It's a executive authoritarian leader who then controls these companies. And that's, I think, is what we are at the risk of going through. So Russian oligarchy was horrible in the 1990s. What's even worse is when that oligarchy became completely subservient to Putin.
Yes.
That's the Trump agenda. Tim Cook wasn't there because he wanted to be the puppet master. He was there because he was afraid of the power that Trump could wield, impacting Apple, impacting Apple's supply chain, all sorts of other import-export business, technology, and so on. So I think we are at the cusp of some very consequential changes, but it could actually end up weakening some of the tech companies vis-a-vis the executive, but not in a good way.
We're hearing a lot about attention that our taxpayer funds and funds of the state are directing directly toward certain technology companies that have only grown in their scale and in their power and influence, like Palantir, which is,
Yes.
being funded for a so-called development of a master list of surveillance
Hmm.
Americans, is complicit in an ongoing genocide, in my opinion, funded by American taxpayers against most of our will in Gaza. We're looking at the directions taken by these companies with artificial intelligence to make calculations of collateral damage and death and life. Do you feel like these sorts of directions are A, what you're fearing and being concerned of, and B, do you feel like these are the directions that larger parts of big tech may take?
Absolutely. Again, let me separate and try to minimize my own value judgments. I think one of the concerning things with AI, the next stage of AI is going to be all sorts of autonomous military applications in identifying targets, in weapons, in military robots. I'm concerned about all of them. And I see no appetite on the side of any government to stop that. Even Europe, even the European Union, which has been generally much more proactive in terms of protecting certain democratic individual rights or principles, draws the line at military applications. So that's a big concern. The second issue is that the tech government nexus becomes much more troublesome, both in terms of concerns about an oligarchy emerging and in terms of the Putinization of the US economy with the government controlling or the executive or leader controlling these companies when the said companies make a lot of business with the government. So Amazon is not out of the crosshairs of the US government. But at the end of the day, Amazon doesn't make much money from the US government. Okay, the Postal Service, there's some important issues, licensing, etc. But a company like Palantir, its main customer is the government. So the relationship between those companies and the president and the president's entourage is going to be, by definition, more troublesome. And I think there's going to be more instances of that sort of interaction, even from other companies like Google and Microsoft and so on.
Okay, got it. Yeah. And much of this is directly going to be tied to concerns that a lot of economic anxieties that people face both in this country and around the world. So we'll touch on those issues as we continue. Nishat, please jump on in.
So, in your book, you refer to these techno oligarchs as these tech titans who seem to have unprecedented power over information, labor markets, and maybe even democratic discourses. And you point out that we need to reshape a future by creating these countervailing forces, particularly by ensuring that there's a diverse set of voices, interests, and perspectives that act as a counterweight to these dominant visions. So I want to ask you, Professor, that to what end do you envisage this political and social power changes? Do you imagine a kind of a redistribution? Do you imagine a transfer of power or more collective organizations? How do we kind of take on these dominant techno-oligarchic forces?
Well, I think, again, we have to sort of first understand the phenomenon. The progressive era US authorities were rightly worried about Standard Oil, its monopoly, and how it was, affecting consumers and producers. Let's bear in mind a few things about Standard Oil, the image of octopus notwithstanding. First of all, its market capitalization at the time of its breakup was $35 billion in today's dollars. That's less than 1/100th of each one of the big six right now. NVIDIA, Microsoft, all of them are about more than 100 times. Their revenues are about 100 times larger as well. So these are truly much, much, much bigger. Second, Standard Oil was very important because oil was already becoming important. But it was just one sector. But as you said, Ramesh, many of these tech companies are in multiple sectors, and they're really much more important inputs into these sectors. They control the direction of technology. That's what I really worry about. And then third, Standard Oil, even in its height, didn't control information, didn't control the media. It may, make threats or influence on some media outlets, but it was completely cut out from the process of individuals getting information and forming their opinions, etc. The technology companies' secret sauce has always been that they are in the business of information. And today that has become intensified because of their control of data. So any company that controls your information is going to have more power than a similar sized company that has no control over your information. So that all makes me worried that the power of each one of these companies is really unrivaled in at least recent history, but any of the history that I know about that goes back 10,000 years. So what can you do about it? Well, the three dimensions that I have highlighted are all related, but they're separate. I think you can certainly reduce the size of these companies. So that would be reducing their static monopoly power. This is what's actually in front of both US and European authorities. They're all thinking of breakup of Google because of the ad tech business where, Google has created a monopoly by controlling both the platform over which ads are sold, the sale side and the buy side. And you can make similar arguments for Meta, for example, with its control of multiple platforms, etc. So that's a very radical action, nothing to be sort of decided on a whim, but certainly breakup or other remedies could make the system more competitive. That by itself may or may not deal with the information monopoly. So data may still be in the hands of all of these companies. They may still decide what you see, how you see it, how that's processed, what is deemed okay, what is not deemed okay. So I think we need to have a broader conversation about independent journalism, independent sources of information, who decides what shapes public opinion, etc. I think we have to be completely committed to free speech, freedom of expression, but within those constraints, there are still questions about how information is controlled and presented to people. And then the third, which I think is the most challenging one, which has been my focus, a lot of my focus, is about the direction of technology. How can you create a more level playing field in which different types of technologies, not just the business models of these companies, become influential?
Yeah, it's, we're sitting through a moment in the US, and I wonder how you connect these statistics that I'm going to point out to what you're describing, where we see the youngest generation in the United States, and I'm told also in the UK, though I have to check that, is the first to make less than their parents, even if you control for inflation. We're seeing declining life expectancy both in the United States and UK, which might have a lot to do with the asymmetry tied to the benefits of so-called innovations. I'm wondering how you connect these two critiques and concerns around tech.
Yeah, so these are topics I have studied, and I'll add one more fact. The income picture is a bit complicated, but certainly the expectation or the perception of people is what you say, that the majority of the people in the United States report that they think their children are going to be worse off than them. If you look at the income statistics, it's not as bad as that. Median real earnings have increased, but there was a period of 30 some years from 1980 to 2014. It was really flat or declining for workers with less than a BA. Life expectancy has been flat in the United States. It may have declined a little. If you look at mortality rates for middle-aged people, that has increased. And that's really striking. The only other country I know where that has happened is in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union because of men. It's happened only for men for endemic alcoholism. And that's why some economists like Angus Deaton and Ann Case call these deaths of despair. And let me add one other fact to that. In the United States, and this is also common with the UK, we have a striking increase among young people who say they don't trust democracy. They think other systems rather than democracy could be better, including military rule or authoritarian rule. So there is a real collapse of trust in institutions, especially among the young, which is very, very surprising because, young people have typically been over the post-war period, post-World War II period, have been more pro-democratic, more excited about the democratic experiment. They feel disenchanted with what has happened in the United States over the last 40, 50 years. Inequality, quality of public services, a feeling of voicelessness.
Do you feel, just quick follow up, do you feel like so much of this is tied to the increased absence of checks and balances in the United States democracy? What about the kind of global issues in this? So what I'm getting at here is like corporate lobbyist power, and Google was the biggest lobbyist during the Obama administration. Citizens United, like these,
I think those are contributing factors. In the interest of transparency, this is the topic of my new book, which
cool.
will come out in August next year. And indeed, I think my argument is that liberal democracy, though it still remains the best system for delivering what people want. And authoritarian governments have a worse track record. It has failed relative to the aspirations that it has set. And a lot of that is about what I call post-industrial economics, sort of the digital information-based economics hasn't created a natural pathway for shared prosperity, but also because our politics got messed up, but not just because of Google and lobbying. I think a very large part of it is that people like us who are very well educated have become very influential, but it has created a very lopsided political economy, especially on the center left. So center left parties that were getting votes and advocating for manual workers, low income workers have essentially changed their tune, both in terms of their high level priorities and low level implementation. And that really, we have to think of this as a system. Silicon Valley has a very important role in that because I think the tech sector has contributed both to the importance of these college skills and quantitative skills, but also it has given a sort of an ideology of technocratic expertise, which sort of acts like a fig leaf for the more educated segments to sort of impose their preferences.
I wonder if on a messaging level, it's also about the perceived disconnection between, I mean, I'll just speak from the perspective my friends at the Young Turks often say, like who I join, as you know, like once a month, they say that there's just an inherent disconnection between what the voting base would want, including those of us left in the Democratic Party, and what the donor class would wish for. And
I think that's right, but I would say we would be trivializing the problem when we speak of the donor class only. So there are some very interesting studies here. One group of studies come from political scientists like Martin Gillens or Larry Bartels. What they show is that lawmakers vote very much along the preferences of the top third of their constituents, and they are essentially uncorrelated with the wishes of the bottom two-thirds.
Okay.
But it's not just the donor class.
Right.
And then there is a very interesting research agenda by Suresh Naidu, Nicola Longe-Marx, and Ilyana Kuzmienko. They look specifically at the Democratic Party, and they show that the Democratic Party's policy preferences, while still remaining redistributive in the form of redistribution, have shifted very much to favor what the more educated Democrats want, which is taxes and spending, and away from what low education manual workers want, protection, job programs, minimum wages, unions, etc. And another set of studies also emphasizes the rise of cultural politics. Again, that has been a wedge issue between working class constituents and the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party typically has opted for the preferences of its more educated, more urban, especially large city urban members.
Yeah, so not just donors, that's for sure.
Not just donors.
Elites and
I mean, I don't want to take the blame away from donors. I think it would be fantastic if somehow Citizens United was repealed somehow, which I don't see how. But that I saw also is tip of the iceberg. Lobbying is a huge industry. It's as pernicious as campaign contributions.
Some very interesting points there, Professor. So just to kind of zero in back on the trust of the youth in institutions and specifically democracy. So recently, Senator Mark Kelly came out with a roadmap to make AI work for all Americans, including an AI Horizon Fund that would provide resources to reinvest in workers and infrastructure. So do you think, in your opinion, is this more of a state involvement a good starting point in imagining a shared prosperity to gain popularity with the youth?
Absolutely, 100%. I think the principle that Senator Kelly articulates is very appealing. How to achieve it, of course, is not trivial, but the principle that we have this AI leadership in the United States right now, or co-leadership with China increasingly, because we have some very valuable resources, worker skills, education system, infrastructure, energy. And there is a danger that the current path of AI companies may actually damage these foundations. So it's like sort of undermining the very foundations that created that leadership. And So the plan is calling for making sure that there is sufficient investment in these several elements, including worker skills. I think that's very, very important. And there are many ways in which those funds could be raised. One that Senator Kelly mentions that I favor a lot is, for example, taxing the parts of tech that are creating problems like digital ads, the digital ad ecosystem. But I think we could even be more holistic. The direction of tech is so important. Think of the AGI fever. I am not worried that AGI is going to come next year and super robots are going to kill us. But the AGI agenda is all about automation. But automation is not by itself a recipe for building shared prosperity. And there are so many other things that you can do with technology, a lot of it understood going back, way back to 1950s. And there are templates for developing technologies, including AI, differently. And not exclusively, but alongside, using AI for automation of some routine tasks, but also AI as an information system, as a collaboration tool, complementing humans. All of those, I think, require more competition. So therefore, I think first articulating what it is that we want from technology is very important, and we need to have a public debate on that. That's just about at the level of aspirations, not like forcing any company, but just articulate what it is that people want. What is it that we can think is feasible and it's not feasible. And then, I think one way of achieving that is greater competition, breaking the power of these companies over the new technologies because they can acquire all their rivals could be an important step in allowing different kinds of technological ecosystems to emerge.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's a bit before we go right back to the economic and labor and job issues tied to emerging AI. I thought we could actually just sort of shine a light on this AI. I wouldn't just say hype, but this AI kind of attention that's taking over all of our lives. Context around how we met also in person, Daron, on campus at UCLA. So, there, as you said so correctly, I studied AI when I was a Media Lab student. There were many different kinds of AI. There are many different kinds of AI. There are many different approaches that were taken by artificial intelligence researchers toward trying to emulate or understand intelligence. And in many ways, even historically, it was reductive. It didn't consider emotional intelligence. It didn't consider non-human intelligence. Nonetheless, I recall, in Marvin Minsky's labs when I was a graduate student, the focus there on trying to build technologies that actually could make sense of the world and, actually be able to maybe not feel, but at least make analytical, logical deductions, we could say. So there was a more interest in rational and analytical thinking that was tied to the attempt to build software in that image. So now I'm wondering how you feel about this is, some, including some guests we formerly had on Utopias, describe these generative AI systems as extensions of large language models, which have existed since the 1970s, tied to the directions of big data, which is all about pattern recognition. One of our previous guests called it cognitive task automation. So that's very different than all the different kinds of intelligences that were even part of AI, let alone human or non-human intelligence. So I wonder what your thoughts are on this. And then I want to follow up by asking you about informational diversity, which I know you've done some research on.
Perfect. Thank you, Ramesh. That's such a great setup. I could answer this question for the next hour. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to impose that on you or your listeners. But let me first go one step higher. And let's not talk about AI. Let's talk about technology in general. And I think there is a tendency both among economists and lay people discussion of thinking of technology having an effect on wages, on employment, on prosperity. But not all technology is created equal. Different technologies do very different things. And what I have emphasized, documented theoretically, empirically, historically in my work is that especially you have to distinguish between automation technologies and those that increase the set of tasks or the sophistication of tasks that humans perform. And those two are very important and almost polar opposites, because automation displaces workers, reduces the set of things that they do, squeezes them into a more uniform set of things. And even when it increases productivity, which doesn't always happen, but even if it increases productivity, it's not great news for labor. It reduces the share of labor in national income or in value added. Whereas if you use technology for allowing workers to do new things, and in fact, many of the things that we do, in professional occupations, even in blue collar occupations, didn't exist 60, 70 years ago. Those are all new things. That's what creates wage growth. That's what creates possibilities for a more balanced pattern of economic growth. Digital technologies have long been conceptualized as tools of automation. And that's wrong because, again, going back to the 1960s, many people saw how digital technologies could be used for collaborating with humans so that humans become better decision makers, creating new possibilities, new functions for humans. And many people sort of emphasize that. I think one that I like to quote here is, and that's my bridge to AI, is JCR Licklider, who,
Yes.
perhaps more than anybody else deserves the title of the grandfather of the internet, because it was his sort of vision that became the basis of the ARPANET in the sort of the prototype for the internet. And he wrote in a 1960 essay, Man-Machine Symbiosis, or article in IEEE, that in not so distant future, human brains and computers are going to act in completely different new ways because they're going to be coupled in the way that they process information. Well, I think that was very inspiring, except that it was 65 years ahead of its time. The
Right.
technologies of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s don't allow that. AI does, actually, with pattern recognition and with other things. So AI is actually the kind of platform that could bring Licklider's vision to reality. And this is what I've called over the last decade pro-worker AI.
Yes.
Very different from AI used for automation, is for creating more sophisticated, better, newer tasks for workers. Here's an example, and you'll see that it requires some different architecture, but it is still based on the same sort of strengths of AI that you already articulated. So imagine that we create a tool that you give to electricians that, with the pictures that it takes in real time and with a few inputs from the electrician, it enables electricians to recognize much more complex problems and deal with much more complex new equipment than current regular electricians are not currently able to do. That would be a huge pro-worker tool because it will solve a bottleneck with electricians. It will enable electricians to earn much more, to do many more things. Is this a dream? No, absolutely. It's actually well within the frontier. What you would need, and it's some of the same pattern recognition and a little bit of the generative AI, you would need, to train this system first on all of the electrical equipment. So it requires very specialized knowledge on electrical equipment, on the basic principles of electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, so that actually it has a spatial and physical understanding of the problems that are being tackled. And then from use cases of the best electricians around the world dealing with similar problems. And trained in sort of as a medium-sized generative AI with the right amount of pattern recognition, this to actually prototypes of this tool exist for other things, not for electricians, but for field engineers. It's well within our architecture, but it's got nothing to do with LLMs. It's
Right.
not as generalist. It doesn't have all these hallucination problems because it needs to be very accurate and on, very clear factual and electrical engineering understanding. But it's quite feasible. Those are the kinds of tools that you can develop for a whole panoply of occupations. But we're just not investing in them.
Yeah, it's awesome that you brought up Licklider, who's a huge influence on why I went into tech and continues to like be an inspiration to me. And it's also a great example of how, I mean, that's in a sense a deeper history of decades ago. But I also, wonder how many of us remember that the different faces of the internet, even of the web itself, were governed in very different ways and stood for very different outcomes.
100%, yes.
Even dating back about 15 years ago, maybe 10 to 15, where there was a robust debate about social media being potentially healthy for democracy.
Absolutely, 100%. No, it is often asked whether AI or how much better than the internet AI is going to be. Well, my take is actually I'm a huge fan of the internet.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, it's been used in some bad ways, and I am not a fan of social media. But the internet as an information system is unrivaled. As a platform for creating new goods, services, new tasks, it's just amazing. As a way of creating new ways of bringing people together. I mean, okay, we may be very unhappy about some of the labor practices of Uber and the way that it has expanded into cities by breaking rules. But Uber, Airbnb, those are just amazing ways that you could not have done without an internet-like structure and plus GPS and more decentralized computing. I mean, those are really exciting things, and many more of those sort of platform innovations could be possible. So if AI, I think, replicates the internet in some ways, I'll be very happy. But for that to be the case, AI needs to become a platform for creating new goods and services.
I wonder how much of a debt to all of us, the public, though, these companies, I don't know. Oh, I don't, that's sort of a moral or
Yeah,
almost political statement. But I wonder, given that none of these companies would be worth anything, even though they've done remarkable innovations, but they were on top of public investments
that's
into
right.
the Advanced Research Projects Agency network, ARPANET, that you alluded to, that Licklider was sort of our influence on, that our beloved colleague Len Kleinrock at
Yes.
UCLA, who's still around and is really troubled by many directions things have taken, has pointed out one, that and they wouldn't be worth anything without our data, which we're not sure what is being
Yeah.
gathered by whom, kept for how long, and how much of that is creating material wealth for these
Yeah.
platforms.
So, I mean, I think I would like to distinguish two things in that context. One is public investment. I think public investment, by its nature in a market economy, is there because nobody else is going to provide those resources. The government has to invest in infrastructure, in a train network. Well, in the US, it hasn't, but fortunately, in air traffic controllers, where we're reducing their numbers. But there are these very important resources. And then in return, the government has to raise taxes. So that's why companies pay taxes, and tax evasion is a problem precisely for that reason, because we still expect the government to provide these services. So there, it's a moral question and it's an economic question. How much more taxes companies should pay, how much more progressivity should there be in the tax system. It's a very, very important, it's a technical but important debate. But then there are the public's resources, meaning not the government sectors, but the overall people's resources like data. And there is really no justification for that very valuable resource to be extracted and used without compensation. So think of it this way. This is go around asking Silicon Valley, which one's more important for the future of the economy, data or real estate? I think everybody would say data. But imagine that I took this much less important resource, real estate, and I said, there's no more any market in real estate. You cannot buy or rent real estate. It's first come, first serve. And if somebody else is using it, you can just take it away from them. Everybody would be just shocked, even imagining something like that. But that's how we treat data.
Yeah.
And a second ago, I gave you the example of, complex use cases of troubleshooting, repairing, and dealing with problems of electrical equipment by expert electricians. That's high quality data. Does that data exist? No, it doesn't exist. Why should I, as an electrician that's at the top of my game, waste my time, creating that data rather than do my business? Because nobody's going to pay for me. So in data, if you don't have a proper ownership structure and a price system, bad data is going to drive out good data. We are training our LLMs on data from Twitter, X, and Facebook. That's bad data.
Not the best of human
Not the
expression.
best of human expression, exactly. Or, companies are sort of violating copyrights in order to sort of get it from books or course material. But to the extent that data matters, high quality data matters. So if there was a proper ownership structure, legal structure, we could have data markets in which much more of that high quality data is produced. That would be good for tech companies, by the way, or the future of tech. And it would be good for people who would actually make money out of this.
Yep. And we could even imagine unions representing.
Absolutely. And in fact, if we go to the details, and that's why this is a question of, we need to build new legal structure. You cannot have, for most data, for some of them you can, if it's very specialized, but for most data, you cannot have individual ownership because everybody could recognize a cat. So that would drive the price of recognizing a cat to zero, even if it's very valuable. So you do need a sort of a collective ownership structure, so like data unions.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned there is how, sort of bad data or social media data can
Drives out the good data, yeah.
drive it out. And this actually makes me want to ask you directly about something you pointed out when we were together in person, but also I've seen you talk about and write about, which is that these generative AI systems, right, which are replicating our human behavior and human expression, are not actually replicating our diversities of expression. They're
Absolutely.
actually following homogenized directions of only certain voices. So you said it's flattening informational diversity.
100%. 100%.
Just like troublingly, we have seen even in Wikipedia itself. I mean, Wikipedia is awesome. I love Wikipedia, but it's not truly representative of the voices of those online.
100%. 100%. There are a number of forces here. One is that it's a generalized form of what the political scientist James Scott talked about in the context of state policies. He called it making things legible. So you have very detailed local conditions, but that huge diversity, which is a source of richness, strength, local adaptation, is very difficult to comprehend for somebody, say a bureaucrat who wants to put a land ownership system or wants to put a tax system. So you simplify, you get rid of the details. So James Scott talked about that in the context of states, but it's true for any top-down control. And what tech companies in the context of platform economics and data collection are in the business of top-down control. So they've done the same thing. They've gotten rid of a lot of details and look at the centralized tendencies. So that's already reducing diversity. But then there is a second force, which is that there's a feedback from what human decision makers get and learn. So because they're now learning more and more from these repositories that have been created by homogenizing it, they're having more similarity in their own way of thinking as well. And AI is now exacerbating that. So there's a study that shows how Stack Overflow, for example, which was an amazing website where people used to post questions about programming, the different languages, subroutines, etc. And there's a Stack Overflow for math as well. And that's a lot of the data from Stack Overflow was critical for ChatGPT to be trained in understanding subroutines, etc. But then once people can get that from ChatGPT, traffic in Stack Overflow collapses. So humans stop creating new, interesting, creative data. In a follow-up study, my co-authors and I have found the same thing on Wikipedia, that in places where ChatGPT is a more substitute for Wikipedia, you have much less activity in Wikipedia, both in creative side and the use side.
So it's troublingly both a way of taking the kind of wide range of voices that we all represent and flattening that which is fed into these.
Flattening it and also reducing the creation.
Precisely, because the large language models, which themselves are flattened, then end up flattening our own lives and our own knowledge. It's sort of like this human technological recursivity.
Exactly.
Thing. That's absolutely fascinating and deeply troubling. That's a huge area we have to work on, especially in a planet where we see cultural, well, at least linguistic diversity and certainly biodiversity disappearing as well.
Yeah, I think something that I want to ask, which is probably what most of your audience will be interested to know, is that what jobs are safe from automation for now and forever?
I think part of the difficulty of answering that question is because everything is uncertain. I think nobody knows what the capabilities of tomorrow's AI systems will be. Those who are really optimistic are banking on some sort of scaling laws that we can double the amount of compute power and data we put into these models, and that's going to double their capabilities, however you measure that, even an acceleration. Those of us who are a little less optimistic might think that those scaling laws may not apply. But then there's also the direction. So the directional issue that I mentioned, like whether you use AI mostly for automation or for creating pro worker new tasks, etc., that's going to matter as well. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer. But as a general principle, I would mention two important points. First of all, whenever you are doing something that's substitutable to AI applications, meaning AI models stacked up on foundation models or something that has been turned into good applications like that we have now for accounting systems or tax preparation, that's not going to be great because your skills have now been commoditized. And then the second is the extent to which this happens is going to be a function of how much AI tries to mimic human intelligence. And that's the more AI tries to mimic human intelligence, even imperfectly, the more it's going to become substitutable to humans in a range of tasks. Not in all tasks, because there's some limits to what the current models can do in terms of social, creative, problem solving, etc. But you can push them more in that direction. And therein lies, I think, a general issue that goes back to my earlier conversation with Ramesh, which is that if you buy into the broad agenda that I'm trying to outline here, which is that we should think of AI as an information tool complementary to humans, it is not a good idea to try to make AI mimic humans because like and like don't collaborate that well. If Ramesh and I have exactly the same skills, there isn't much for us to collaborate. If we have different skills, if he can do things that I can't and I can do things that he can't, then there's much more room for collaboration. So you want AI to be somewhat different, still comprehensible to humans, but somewhat different. And in that case, fewer things will be threatened by AI because more things can work with AI.
It's a really, really important point. And it's also a reminder that human history, and certainly even fairly recent human history, has always been, involved humans and machines of different forms and humans and tools of different forms in assemblages and
Yeah,
relations.
100%.
Staying on with these questions of economic security, economic inequality, like hopes for economic security for all, I hope, around our planet. I wonder how to make sense of the massive, massive amounts of money investments going in by VCs, venture capitalists into AI firms. I'm again here in Silicon Valley, like you would not believe the kinds of billboards I see around me driving around here. Trust humans with AI. I see billboards with that around those topics. AI therapists, AI relationships, like the movie Her,
Yeah.
one of my favorite movies.
Well, I think another thing that's very concerning is if you listen to business podcasts or anything like that, all of the ads are right now about how if you don't invest in AI, you're going to fall behind your competitors. So managers are under increasing pressure to adopt AI, to do anything with AI. And I've spoken to a number of managers, mid-level to high-level managers from different companies, and now their bosses are setting them AI targets.
Yeah.
It's not enough for you to do a task Y and Z. You have to do task Y and Z at least 50% with AI because they're afraid they're going to fall behind competitors. That's what their board or that's what their shareholders expect from them. And that, of course, creates very bad dynamics in terms of excessive, too soon investment without understanding the technology.
Absolutely. It's something of a golden goose. And the other thing I notice is many in the sort of tech evangelist community right here, like right around the corner from where I am right now, often speak of, the Terminator scenario and kind of transhumanist scenario. And they almost speak of the inevitability of our AGI, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
for generalized intelligence, when they are the ones they speak of inevitability when they are the ones constructing that supposed inevitability. So that one also kind of, uh, for lack of a better term, weirds me out.
No, no, it should be. And it's actually like a very interesting dynamic in my opinion, because I mean, I have a lot of respect for some people in the AI safety community.
Yes.
They are there with the best intentions, they're real experts. But I think when the good side of AI is pitted only against AI as a danger to humanity because of its advancement, you see what's happening. Both sides of the debate already take it for granted that AI is going to advance extremely slowly. I mean, extremely rapidly.
Yes.
So the prospect that this has to be a deliberative process. It's not going to go that fast. It can't go that fast. You cannot bank on AI to do everything right away, and that we have a directional choice. All of these things fall by the wayside in this debate. So I think that's part of the reason why this is not a very productive debate. Both sides of the debate elevate AI above where it is. Now, I'm not an AI pessimist. Okay, some people might hear me and say I'm an AI pessimist. No, I'm not an AI pessimist. I actually think our future is going to have AI, and we could benefit a lot from it. And I believe the progress here is going to be ongoing, but it's going to be ongoing at the speed that we've seen over the last 2 years, which is, moderate to slow. And the step of integrating it into our organization is going to be very slow and very painful. But that means that we actually have some time to be deliberative about it. It's not like, oh, during the next year, either we take the lead or China takes the lead, and whoever takes the lead is going to dominate the world. I mean, I think that's just childish.
Yeah, there's a room for a lot more deliberative thinking around this rather than buying into certain kinds of gospels, even gospels of anxiety, like it's coming for us all, even though
Yes,
we're
absolutely, 100%. And here's one other, perhaps less obvious implication of that, which I find very worrying. And let me preface that by saying, I've been for the last, 20 years a big critic of China, and I am not welcome in China in general because of my criticism of their labor system, their authoritarian, their information control. But despite that, I think US and China have to collaborate. They're now the two biggest powers. There's so many international problems, pandemics, climate change, AI governance. And this sort of AGI is around the corner mentality has created a completely zero sum thinking about that. Either China takes the lead and we're dead, or we take the lead and we dominate China. And that's really negative for any possibility of collaboration between these two powers.
And we must think of a more multipolar global vision that includes the global south. The fastest growing population on the planet is the continent of Africa. The youngest population on the planet is continent of Africa. The global south cannot and should not just on a moral and ethical level, but also I believe, on a global economic level, be simply spaces and spheres of economic extraction, labor extraction, rare earth mineral extraction, data extraction, all of this.
100%. And it's also, I think, a little arrogant to think that, a handful of people, perhaps 1,000 people in the United States, have a lot to contribute for the future of AI, and 1.5 billion Indians and 2 billion other people in the emergent South have nothing to contribute.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you then about, where you feel what you think we can do about the economics of all of this, right? There are a lot of proposals. We alluded to some of them earlier in the conversation, even including data unions. There are
Yeah.
proposals that have circulated, like Andrew Yang, who's been on this podcast, talks about popularized universal basic income. That didn't seem to necessarily change the levers of extraction.
No, it doesn't. I think that's why I don't think UBI is a solution to these problems. And I don't think there's a silver bullet. But my perspective here again comes from thinking that the most important choice ahead of us is the direction of technology. Whether we're going to develop AI just as an automation tool or for making workers more productive for shared prosperity. Whether we're going to develop it as a surveillance or information centralization tool, or the way that other sort of people from the history of computing, like Ted Nelson, thought as a decentralized system.
I love Ted Nelson. That's so
Yeah,
cool. You mentioned Ted Nelson.
yeah,
Everyone talks about, of course, Tim Berners-Lee, but what about
yeah,
Tim and Xanadu, the
yeah.
Xanadu system? Yeah.
So there are all these directional things. So the question is, how can we actually make sure that not the direction that's just favored by a few people, but the one that works best for the health of democracy, for shared prosperity, and for productivity improvements perseveres.
Do you
Uh,
believe do you believe in this proposal that some progressive economists like Yanis Varoufakis, who's joined our pod, he argues for a universal basic dividend that people should have some equity. Is that even politically realizable? What do you
no,
think?
first of all, it's not politically realizable, but then again, some of the things that I suggest perhaps may be politically difficult as well. But I also don't think that it solves the fundamental problem. I mean, those to me sound like bread and circus solutions. We
Yeah.
take the current path as given and we try to create ways of dividing the crumbs and then perhaps find some entertainment for the masses. I think we can do better than that.
Yes.
So if we really go in a pro-worker AI direction, if we go in a pro-democracy AI direction, actually we'll be socially and economically enriched. So for that, I think the general economic principles are quite quite a good starting point. We have to get rid of distortions that favor directions that are currently dominant and not always so good, and we have to create more competition. So what are those directions? First of all, the tax system. In the United States and in many other countries, we tax labor, we subsidize capital. That means that firms have an excessive incentive to automate work. So create a fairer or more balanced tax system. Another one, we have created a social media ecosystem where you can make money from ways that are very negative in terms of mental health consequences, in terms of creating misinformation, sensationalism, exaggeration, echo chambers. And if you look at the roots of that, it's all in digital ads. It's all in the way that data is collected, data is monetized. So for that reason, I believe we need to have a digital ad tax so that it creates a room for alternative business models to emerge. Then we need an AI agency, a federal AI agency that is both a source of state of the art best practice information so that it can attract some of the talent so that the government or the bureaucracy also has some AI talent and also perhaps subsidizes some moonshot, more pro-worker, more pro-democracy projects, and then much more competition. If at the end of the day, the future of AI is in the hands of a handful of companies, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Microsoft, it's going to be their business model, their current occupation, their preoccupations that are going to dominate. So if you need more startups, more competition, and then we can also think of the public resources like a data system, data market to support that, and other things. And I think giving more voice to labor would also be a useful thing in that process.
Before I guess Ramesh asks you, Professor, about your utopia, I just want to say that my utopia is probably a 15-hour work week, which was promised to be by Keynes in the 1930s. But clearly that's not how it's looking right now. Since Bernie Sanders talking about a 32-hour work week. Do you think it can happen? How and when can we expect that to happen? And why didn't technology magically solve all our problems, taking into account everything that you've said right now about how we can redirect and move on to a better path? So
Well,
do we see this
let
happening?
me start with the counter argument that you know, I think a 0-hour work week would be horrible for all of us. Humans, in my assessment, find satisfaction if they believe they contribute to some common good. It could be society at large, their community. It's Work is not the only way of doing it, but we need some way of contributing to that common good. And I don't think all of us just playing video games or doing art is going to be that. So as we reduce work, we need to find other ways of humans finding meaningful contribution. Now, of course, it is true that reality of work hasn't always contributed to that. Routine, boring, backbreaking work does not contribute this kind of contribution. So we, in our jobs, are fortunate because I think our jobs are more pleasant and they're not as backbreaking, they're not as monotone, so we can talk of this contribution. But I think that's the aspiration. Blue collar workers, people who work with their hands as well as their minds, or their combined mind and heart and body, they have to find that sort of contribution as well. Whether that's going to happen in the form of a 32-hour week, it's going to happen through other work arrangements, I don't know. But I think some sort of productive work has to be at the center of it.
Yeah, it's extremely important for we human beings to continue to be creative, to continue to be active, and to be who we are in our best selves, right? Like empathic, relational beings with creativity, analytical, and sometimes we can be grumpy too.
Yeah.
Putting it mildly. I wanted to just ask you a final question. We're super grateful that you joined us today, Daron.
Oh,
Thank
it's
you.
been my pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
We're sitting at a moment, as we've talked about over the last 75 minutes, where, here in the US and in many and some other parts of the world, we're seeing people's rights feeling like they're under some threat. We're seeing tech and AI big tech, that is, take on greater and greater power over our lives. And there seems to be a sense that many of us feel like we're not sure where the future is going. And, of course, even the word utopia or the book itself was a satire, as you know. But I guess I want to just ask you, what gives you hope? What gives you a sense of where we can go? If we want to make it super simple, what are your utopian visions, if you even believe in such?
Yeah,
Around.
I mean, I think hopeful. So at a high level, what gives me hope is that humans are incredibly adaptive.
Mm.
We have adapted to so many different circumstances and found ways of changing the worst ones, and sometimes found ways of destroying the good ones too. But that adaptive capability, our ability to come together to solve collective problems, I think is the high level thing that gives me hope. And how I would like that to be realized within the next, say, decade or beyond is, first, renewed confidence in liberal democratic principles. I think there is no alternative to democracy. They're all much worse. And there is no alternative to core values of liberalism that, allows individual freedoms to be realized and respected. But then liberal democracy, I think, has to create shared prosperity. Without that, we won't survive. Without that, liberal democracy won't survive. And shared prosperity is not going to happen through, I think, universal dividend or universal basic income. It's going to happen with market systems and technologies that use and increase the value of diverse skills. Not just those of us who are into, very high-end professional fields or quantitative, but how can we use technology to make gardeners, electricians, plumbers, blue-collar workers more productive and their contribution more valuable for society? And the less routinized and the less backbreaking difficult physical work, but the more sort of a combination of interacting with the real world, but using, understanding better information about the real world, I think manual work can also become much more contributive. And I think that's the utopia that I would hold on to.
Bravo. Thank you so much for joining us today, Daron Acemoglu.
Thank you for having me, Ramesh. Thank you, Nishat.
Thank you. Thank you, Daron.
Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know. And feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support.